Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
We have begun officially Sefer Devarim, the book of the Greek, please. Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy. Meaning, any chemistry majors here? Deutero, you might remember, is one of those great Greek suffixes, or prefixes, excuse me. Two. And nomos, meaning law. It is the law.
Yay.
Two. But wait a minute. This is not like Torah the sequel. Right? We don't do sequels in Judaism. That's very important to hold on to. We got one testament and that was it. So what is the second law? What is the Deuteronomy talking about? What is talking about? The restatement of the first law. Deuteronomy is called Deuteronomy because some clever guy noticed that a lot of Deuteronomy is talking about the other 4 books of the Torah. So one of the 5 books of the Torah spends a lot of time talking about the other 4 books. Does that really qualify as being its own book? I mean, we don't consider the Cliff Notes to Hamlet to be like the 4th act. It's something completely separate.
Bears repeating.
It bears repeating. But it's not mere repetition, especially in this week's parasha of Devarim, of Deuteronomy itself. Moses retells the story of how we left Egypt, of all the things that happened, a lot of them bad, all the things God did for us, a lot of them good. But why bother retelling a story that the people he is talking to have already experienced, and the people who are reading read it only a few chapters ago by reading, the first 4 books of the Torah? Well, because his retelling is not merely a journalistic restatement. His retelling is a framing. It is a contextualizing. It is interpretive. The Torah takes time to tell its own story in a way that tells you stories can be told differently, even if they are the same story. I know, that's a little bit of a head scratcher, but there are multiple ways to tell the same story and yet it still be the same story. We all know, of course, that our Bible, the Jewish Tanakh, has been appropriated by other faiths, sometimes whole cloth, and sometimes merely content taken, and retold, reimagined, reunderstood through the lens of other religions. That's entirely possible. And indeed, the 5th book of the Torah, Deuteronomy, is trying to warn us that just having the text itself is not enough. Everyone can have the text. Anyone can have the text. You can just get the Hebrew down and you can read it, but that doesn't mean you understand it. That doesn't mean you know what it ought to mean. It merely means that you have a translation. But the real translation happens here, here. What Moses is modeling throughout his great speeches of the book of Devarim, and in particular in his historical recapturing here in the first book or the first parasha, Devarim itself, is reminding the Israelites, or perhaps introducing them to the concept that the story is only half of the truth. The full truth comes only in understanding through the retelling what that story is meant to teach you. Anybody here who's ever heard a fairy tale will know that the punchline is not that Little Red Riding Hood got away from the big bad wolf. The punchline is the moral of that story, of whether you are telling somebody about the dangers of the wood, whether you are telling somebody about the kindness and heroism of others that will come to an aid. How you tell that story makes that story meaningful. And Moses spends these precious last few days he has with the nation of Israel showing them how to tell the story of the Torah. Now, none of us are Moses. None of us have the prophetic insight to be able to retell the story entirely on our own in a way that will crystallize perfectly and clearly exactly what it is God wants us as the Jewish people to take away from this text. And so we have to make it a group project. We make it a team effort. And this is probably seen for most of you most clearly in the retelling of the most famous story in the entire Torah for our people, the story of the Exodus. Anybody here ever been to a Seder? What is that if not a retelling, but a contextualized retelling? Trying to guide us to retell it in a particular way and our own way. Reminding of the different voices around that table, reminding that we combine together to tell the story, not merely to recite the Haggadah, but to comment on it, to understand it, to frame it for our particular need, our family's needs, our community's needs, our needs of the time. That contextualization is continuing the process that was begun by Moses. But we shouldn't only rely on Passover for the spark of telling the story and putting it into a frame. We should be sure to continue to tell these stories, both the historical, the biographical, and the legal, over and over so that we can, together, make sure the narrative is still alive, still vital, and still giving us the message that God wishes us to have. So tell your stories, share them, and make sure the Torah never departs from your lips. Shabbat Shalom.